This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 13 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's titled Taking It Slow, Travelling to Feel Like a Local. So we're talking all about slow travel, whatever that might mean to you. So I think I was actually a huge advocate of slow travel before I had any idea of the concept at all. Back about 15 years or so ago now, I moved to Japan. It was my first time to live abroad. And I stayed there for 2 years teaching English, and I absolutely adored living there and actually wanted to stay longer, but I didn't. I moved on to live in Slovakia and teach English there as well. Now, unfortunately, because, well, for two reasons really, the pay in Slovakia was pretty low and it was kind of hard to live on the amount that I was paid, and because I was offered a job in Germany and it was pretty hard for an Australian who didn't have an EU passport to get a job in Germany, so I wanted to grab it while I could. I left Slovakia after just a year, and it was about that time that I kind of developed my theory of, well, I guess really slow travel, because I realised that having lived in Japan 2 years was a big advantage. The first year, everything was new, and every time something came up, like a seasonal event, like seeing the cherry blossoms or the amazing leaves at autumn time, or the various festivals at different times of year, they were all brand new. And I didn't necessarily make the most of them because I didn't get to find out, where should you go, what's the best way to celebrate this, and all of those sort of local secrets. But the second year, I was really prepared, and I actually made sure I had some time off up my sleeve so I could take a couple of days off here and there during, for example, the cherry blossom season, because that was just amazing. And I'd learnt by then from my friends and students all the best places to go to experience it. And I was prepared for all the festivals. I made sure I just made the most of everything. So I had this theory, in fact, I still have this theory, that to really get to know a place, you need to spend 2 years there. And I remember after realising this, or developing this theory, that I actually became quite sad for a little while, because I realised that if I need to spend 2 years in a place to get to know it, and at the time I was around approaching 30, so perhaps I had only, an optimistic 60 years of life left, that was only 30 more places that I could live for 2 years at once. And 30 places is not very much. And I thought, how am I ever going to see all of the world? Now, of course, I haven't managed to live for for 2 years in every place after that. I did spend nearly 3 years in Germany, and I did get used to that, and I've come back to Australia now. And I think maybe in the future I'll be able to spend another year or two in a few other places. But in the meantime, I just have to do a not quite so slow version of slow travel. And perhaps some tips for that are what we're going to hear from our 3 guests today. So my first guest today is Tim Leffel, who has also spent some time living abroad and may well have the same theory as me. But has got a wealth of ideas of how to experience slow travel and what the benefits are.
Sure. I think a lot of people, obsess over this thing of going beyond the guidebook, finding places that aren't in the guidebook and that kind of thing. It's sort of trendy to say that now, even though that's not really reality in most cases. It has been written about somewhere. But I think the really easy thing almost anyone can do that will just instantly transform your trip is to slow down and spend more time in certain places rather than just trying to check off a bunch of boxes and see all the monuments and take your selfie and move on. Because when you really, spend a week in a place instead of, 8 hours, then you really discover what it's all about. You end up meeting people, you end up kind of seeing the locals' routines and seeing where they shop and experiencing life the way they do. And so you can really get much more of an in-depth experience. And you also discover things that aren't just the, top 3 or 4 places that everybody goes. If you really spend some time in an area and start talking with people who live there or have been there for a while, then they will recommend places to you that are locals restaurants or locals attractions, or they'll tell you about some free concert coming up, things like that, that you might not have known about otherwise because you were in too much of a hurry.
That's so very, very true. And it's always tempting to see a lot in the time you've got, especially like for someone like me coming from Australia. It's a really long way to go to the Northern Hemisphere. It's expensive and you feel like you want to pack a lot in. And it did take me a while to learn that it's really better to pick and choose just a few destinations and get to know them better. And I'll have a higher quality of experience, if not quantity, then.
Right. And a nice side effect of that is you spend less too, because you're not moving around so much. I mean, I've seen people's round the world budgets that were $60,000 or $80,000, and it's because every day or two they were moving on to somewhere else. So they spent a ton of money on planes and trains and cars and everything else,
Yeah, that's
So
frightening, isn't it? And they'd be exhausted as well, so they
yeah,
don't even enjoy
exactly.
half of it.
It's all been a blur, and they look at their photos and go, "Where was that again?"
Yeah, that's right. And that's all they remember. Yeah, exactly true. What kind of places do you like to travel to and stay? I mean, small areas, country areas, or cities? Where do you usually stay for a week or two to get to know it better?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on the place. I'm also not much of a country counter. I've been to some places several times. I think I've been to Peru 5 times now, and I really like it there. And I love hanging out just in those Andean villages that are kind of only reachable on foot. And there's a few places in the world where there are villages like that, like northern Philippines and Nepal. And I just think there's a whole different, like everything in your body sort of slows down when you go to a place like that, and it
You just
just
can't
feels
help
so
it,
much
can
more
you?
relaxing.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
so I like being in places like that because I feel really disconnected from the hectic normal world we're in. But there's nothing wrong with hanging out at the beach for a week either. But it is kind of fun to be in a place that truly feels exotic and feels different, and that can be in your own country even. If you go to a place where the geography is completely different, or the people have a whole different cuisine they eat, or things like that. I mean, it's getting harder and harder as the world gets more globalized and more logoed, where there's
Yes.
chain restaurants everywhere. But still, there is a bit of difference from region to region, even in your own country, and it's kind of fun to explore that. But I do like going to cities, but I tend to not spend a week or two in one city too often, just because it feels busier and more hectic and more stressful a lot of times. So I kind of like medium-sized cities. The place I lived in, Mexico, is probably about 300,000 people. It's a city called Guanajuato, and you can walk everywhere. It's mostly pedestrian only, most of the streets. And so I really like those kind of places. I keep coming back to walking. I guess that's the theme.
Yeah, well, that's the ultimate way to travel slowly, isn't it?
Yeah, and you see more when you walk or even on a bike than you do when you're whizzing by in a vehicle. I like bike tours a lot too. It's a really fun way to explore a country. I've done that in Portugal and in the Czech Republic and in Oregon in the U.S. And it's if you can get on those back roads and
Hmm.
bike around, it's a really pleasant way to spend a week, I think, as long
Oh,
as
yeah, definitely.
your butt doesn't hurt too badly.
Yes, that's true. You've got to get it. Yes, a good saddle. But yeah, European countries especially, I think there's so much to see. I mean, I lived in Germany for a few years, and it was always amazing to me that kind of wherever you drove, there's always something. Probably another small village, but it's got a great restaurant, or another little village with an interesting church, or whatever. I mean, I'm from Australia, where you can drive for hundreds of kilometres and find nothing. So bike touring here is probably not the go. But in Europe, especially, there's so much in such a small area, but without feeling overcrowded or awful.
Right. And back to that slow travel thing, you probably wouldn't go to those villages if you were in a rental car or were on a train trip, but they're worth visiting. And if you're on a bike, then you end up stopping there and spending a couple hours and you go, oh, this is a nice little place.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get to see it without hordes of tourists around, and probably eat in a cafe with tables full of locals. And it's a much more interesting experience to look back on.
Yeah, when we did that bike trip in Portugal, I'm having these images in my head now. There were 3 or 4 villages we stopped in, and there was some castle in the middle that's been there for 600 or 800 years, and we were the only people in it. Just walking around all by ourselves, and that does not happen in most of Europe. And if you're in a capital city,
No, definitely not. Oh, that sounds great. Portugal's really high on my list. It's like the only kind of Central or Western European country I've never been to, and I'm not sure why I haven't, but I keep hearing
yeah,
good
it's
stuff about
lovely.
it.
It probably gets a fifth of the travelers that Spain does for some reason, but I think it's a really attractive place, and it's also about half the price of Spain too.
Just another reminder for me that I definitely have to get to Portugal soon. It's been on my list for far too long. I really like how Tim talked about going to the smaller towns and villages, and on reflection, I agree that the cities are often a bit the same. I mean, they're different, but it's not quite the same as getting outside of the city. Like in Iceland last year, I absolutely loved Reykjavik. It was a great city, but it was the rural parts of Iceland where I really, really fell in love with the place. And they were the parts that were quirkier and just much more vivid memories in my head than the city. So I think it's a good reminder. It's too easy to go to the big cities that we've obviously heard of and are more familiar with, but it's a great slow travel way to approach travel is to go to the lesser known places and the smaller spots. Now, the second guest today is Candace Rardon, one of my favourite guests, and she's back talking about slow travel. Now, she is an expert slow traveller. At the time of our chat, she was spending a couple of months on the Lofoten Islands in Norway writing a book, and that's the kind of trip that she often takes, a few months here and there with a particular purpose. And I have to say, I wish I could do that too. Don't tell my son. I wouldn't swap him for anything. But Candace's lifestyle is something I would like to live in a parallel life.
Well, I love thinking about slow travel sort of on two levels. The first happens to do, or I've come to because of sketching. When I started bringing a sketchbook with me on trips, a sketch doesn't happen in 5 minutes, or it can, but the
Not a
sketches
good
that
one.
I do.
No, and not your beautiful ones.
Well, thank you. But they can take anywhere from an hour to several hours. And so just on a very kind of day-to-day level, that's what I've come to learn about slow travel is just the idea of staying in one place in a city or in a town that I'm sketching in. And I think it really, at first, I felt such tension with it because my natural inclination when you're in a new place is to run around and try to see everything. When I have my camera out, it's like, okay, I want to shoot this and then do this and then go here. And so the idea of pulling a sketchbook out and sitting in the same place for 3 hours was so contrary to the way I used to operate. But it's also turned out to be so incredibly rewarding, getting to know that particular place on a very deep level and observing it in the way you have to when you're sketching. You're studying so many of the elements, you're having to make decisions about what you want to include or not include in a sketch. And that just really is a huge boon for your memory in terms of remembering that place. So that's one of the huge things I've come to love about slow travel. But then on a grander scale, the idea of really shifting a trip and spending more time in a single place and not moving around so much, and just moving through it at a slower rhythm is something I've done kind of in the last year or so. Last summer, I went to Central America and I rented a little house on the shores of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala for 6 weeks. And I am doing the same thing again here in Norway right now on the Lofoten Islands. I'm here for 10 weeks and not going very many places here at all and absolutely loving it.
Oh, I would be too. I'm so jealous.
It's just the idea of slow travel for me is just sinking yourself into the local rhythms of a place and getting to have those closer observations, just getting to kind of see it the way that you might if you were living there. For me is what slow travel is. It's just, taking the long way around. It's taking the slow boat, taking the slow train, getting to observe it. And sometimes so far as to rent a place so that you can just feel at home there.
Yeah, oh, it makes such a difference, doesn't it? I've talked with a couple of other people about that same idea of being somewhere long enough that you end up having the rituals of going to the same bakery or the same cafe, and people
Yes.
get to know you, and they won't talk to you the first, couple of times, or, not particularly more than a, hello or something, but they see you keep
Yeah.
coming back, and then they'll have those more, in-depth conversations, and you'll get to meet people. And you can't do that in any other way. You can't just lob into a new town and turn up on the first day and expect to have the locals trust you and want to talk to you. So that sort of staying in
Exactly.
an extended stay situation is so different.
I think it's really like it's like a relationship. It's your relationship with that place and also with the people in that place. The more time you put into it, the richer and more rewarding it's going to be, just like it would be in sort of a person to person relationship, I think.
That's so true. That's such a good way of putting it. Yes, you're developing a relationship not just with people, but with an actual place.
Yeah,
And yes, and just a fleeting, 1 or 2 days stay. That's never going to be very deep, is it?
exactly. You just kind of, it's like skimming the surface as opposed to really plunging deep and kind of feeling your feet, sink in a little bit. Totally.
So a Kontiki tour is like a one night stand with all the capital cities of Europe, isn't it? So
Exactly.
I think Candace really does have the concept of slow travel figured out for her. I have to confess, I'm not perfect about slow travelling. And on reflection, especially after I made that comment about a Kontiki tour. Now, I've never taken a Kontiki tour, it must be said, but I've done some pretty hectic independent trips as well. I was recently looking back on some travel journals of mine, and I looked up the couple of weeks I spent in Tunisia in northern Africa about 10-ish years ago. And that was a really hectic trip. I think there was only one time that we stayed in the same city or town for more than a night. And even then, we changed hotels because the nicer hotel had no vacancies the first night we arrived. And every day we were moving on. Now, I don't regret this as such because it was one of those trips where we had only the 2 weeks. It was while we were living in Slovakia, and I had just that 2 weeks off between courses. It was sort of an unexpected chunk of time, and it was great to be able to fit in going to Tunisia. And it's not such a vast country that it was, I wasn't exactly exhausted all the time, and I did see so much amazing stuff. And looking back, the political situation has been, not as great there in the last or since that time, and I might not go at the moment. It might have been one of the few chances I had. So fast travel is not always the end of the world. I certainly don't regret that trip. But in a perfect world, if I'd had 2 months to explore Tunisia, well, I would really have some more amazing stories to tell. But anyway, it's all a balancing act. We can't always slow travel all of the time. But my next guest, David Soto Jr., is someone who does spend most of his trips doing some fairly slow travel, at least of late. He's spent some large chunks of time in Mexico, and I think he's really got slow travel sorted out.
When I started traveling for leisure, and I decided that I wanted to go somewhere and live like a local, not like a tourist. It's more you get the culture, and you with these day and age, or this day and age too, you get forever friends because of Facebook, right? So I have friends that are in Mexico, and we've been friends for like 7 or 8 years now. So you develop these relationships with people, by not just going there and going to all the sites and taking pictures and selfies and then getting on a bus and leaving. When you actually there and people like you, and because you develop relationships with them, and they celebrate your birthday, and they invite you to their house, and even if depending on what level of partying you do, for me at different times it was a lot, but they're like, they'll say, hey, we're going here afterwards, or this is what we do when this place closes. And you really, I even worked, I spent 5 months once in Mexico, and I even got a job as a bouncer at a nightclub. And you'll be surprised how people treat you when you save their butt from getting
Yeah, I
in a
bet.
fight. A fight, yeah.
Make some good friends.
Yeah, exactly. And then so when I left that time, people were genuinely, I don't want to say, they were a little sad. They were a little sad to see me go, because I had built these relationships with people just by, you know, being one of them.
Yeah. And 5 months is a long time. You can build up some good friendships that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's such a hard juggle because, like, so, you know, I live in Australia, and it means if we go somewhere, you know, like to Europe or North or South America, it's a really long way, it's expensive, and you want to kind of make the most of it. So it's really tempting to rush around and try and go to lots of different places. But I know that whenever I try and slow it down and stay longer in one place, I get so much more out of it.
Yeah, my thing is, I just want to get up in the morning and go have coffee, and um, if this wherever I'm at has a coffee shop, then I'll go there. Like, that's what I do every day, anyways, right? As a blogger and a writer or whatever, I go to coffee shops and I sit there for hours. And if I can do that in another country, to me, that's traveling. To me, I don't have to go see, these monuments or museums, or just give me a coffee shop in, a coffee shop in Costa Rica, or a coffee shop in Peru, or a coffee shop in Mexico or Italy, and let me sit there. Let me do what I would do in the United States, but let me do it in another country. And I enjoy that. I in just being able to do your daily routine and not have to actually be a tourist, you can stay a lot longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. That's traveling. Yeah, getting to go to a coffee shop in another country, that's traveling, and I agree. That's so true. And from that, you get to learn so much about the local culture, and you might start to get chatting to local people because they see you a few times in the same week or whatever, and all kinds of stuff can arise just from that simple thing of getting up and going to the local coffee shop wherever you're staying. After talking to Dave, I think I want to define slow travel as staying somewhere long enough that you have a regular coffee shop. Maybe even that the people who work in the coffee shop know your order. Maybe that's slow travel. There's so many benefits to travelling slower and especially getting to know local people. I think that's one of my favourite benefits. So thank you very much for listening to episode 13 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I hope it's helped you to be reminded of some of the many, many benefits of travelling slowly. I think it's all too easy, and I'm so guilty of it myself, of trying to see more rather than less because we want to make the most of it. But maybe making the most of it is travelling slowly, seeing less but experiencing more. So my guests today were Tim Leffel. You can find Tim at timleffel.com, and that site has links to all of the amazing stuff he does, including the couple of books he's written, which are particularly useful. If you want to live abroad like he and I did, then he's got a great book to check out there. Candace Rardon is found at the Great Affair website at candacerosrardon.com. And do have a look at her book, Beneath the Lantern's Glow, on Amazon. It just is gorgeous. And finally, David Soto Jr. is found at The Primitive You, so he's at theprimitiveyou.com. And if you're on Instagram, I do recommend checking out David on Instagram as well. He's at ThePrimitiveDave. And, well, he's not there. His gorgeous new dog is. And this dog is now in photos in some of the most scenic parts of the United States. Just gorgeous. Cute dog, gorgeous scenery. I highly recommend you check that out. Dave is travelling very slowly around the US in a van with his dog Rusty. So these details and more will be in the show notes. And for this episode, you can find them at notaballerina.com/13. If you have enjoyed listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast, I would be so grateful if you could help me let other people know about it by leaving a rating or review in iTunes. If you have any feedback or want to tell me about your favourite slow travel destinations, you can tweet me at Amanda Kendall. You can use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod. And if you prefer to get in touch on Facebook, then just look up Not a Ballerina on Facebook. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. for your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.